Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. This is the first Taking Out the Trash of 2025, and I thought it would be a perfect time to visit what was considered one of the biggest flops of last year, Suicide Squad. From the developers Rocksteady and published by Warner Bros., Suicide Squad went on to be both a failure commercially and critically amongst gamers and reviewers. Since the game's live services are being shut down as of this month, I thought it was time to ask, is the game actually that bad, or is it another case of mass hate from the internet without even giving it a chance? Starting off with the good, the game's plot itself, which is based off the DC comics, is extremely engaging and well written. That does not mean the game's dialogue is good, but more on that later. The actual story points themselves though are really well done. There is a fair bit here for die-hard fans, and I think they've done a good job of giving fan service where required, especially early on in the Hall of Heroes Museum, which has a lot of really nice touches, especially for those types of fans. Another major plus for me is the game's movement, and even though I would have liked it to be maybe 5-10% faster, in action it's pretty damn fun to control. As long as you keep in mind that it does feel like it is much more targeted towards a controller, whereas I played with a mouse and keyboard, and even though it's functional, it can definitely be a little overwhelming for those who don't know how to use a mouse and keyboard when it comes to these type of games. It's a little bit confusing in the control scheme at first. You definitely get used to it, but it could have been a little more simplified. Being able to basically fly around everywhere is great as well, as it helps keep the action and the pace going, which leads me into what I consider one of the game's better strengths, and that is its combat. Being a third-person shooter, Suicide Squad aimed to change things up from Rocksteady's previous Arkham series, with a much more high-action approach instead of the more methodical approach of the previous Batman games. And honestly, I think they've done a pretty damn good job overall. Although, in saying that, most of the guns of the same type do feel kinda samey. By that, I mean assault rifles, regardless of their rarity or level, do kinda feel the same regardless, outside of maybe different shooting patterns, whether it be full auto or burst fire. This goes for snipers and shotguns as well. They all do feel very punchy though, and it feels like they shred through Brainiac's minions appropriately as long as you have the right leveled weapon. Add in the combo system, the special abilities, the shields, and you have a pretty fast-paced, hectic combat flow that's pretty fitting of the squad. If I was to level any complaints about the entire system, I think there is a bit too much happening on screen at once when it comes to the combat. The UI is just way too busy, and they could have done better if they simplified things just a little bit. It feels like information overload when you're in the middle of the battle and can be a little bit distracting. Thankfully, this complaint doesn't really ruin some of the best points of the game, and that is its boss battles. Having to take down the likes of the Flash, Green Lantern, the Batman, who in my opinion has the coolest moment in the entire game, however that is subjective, Superman, and even Brainiac himself, every single one of these fights is memorable and just mechanically interesting. To me, these are easily the biggest highlight of the game, and they were my biggest reason for continuing all the way through the entire story, because I wanted to get to the next boss fight. They also probably do the best job of making use of the game's combat system, as most other missions that you do get access to, with more on those in a bit, being a little less inspired to say the least. Another plus to me is the game's overall presentation, but it is definitely not without its faults. Suicide Squad got a lot of heat at launch for its visual presentation, and although yes, it is not the best looking game I've ever seen, it is far from ugly. With the exception of a handful of character models just seeming a bit off, most of the characters look incredible. Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman all look absolutely immaculate. The core of the squad looks pretty good as well, with only Harley Quinn being a little bit off-putting, and I think it's because her cheekbones seem to be a little bit too high. However, once she's wearing makeup, which happens about 20 minutes into the game, to me that issue basically goes away. Also, a lot of the character outfits are pretty nice, if not somewhat limited, and even though there are some things you can get on the battle pass, most of them are ugly as sin, so please don't use those. The last good point of the game for me was the Riddler challenges, though these are definitely a lot more subjective to my own personal enjoyment than maybe yours or anyone else's. However, I found them to be very refreshing because they just broke up the core gameplay loop. Instead of being focused on combat, they focused more on the exploration side, which I think the game was sorely lacking overall. Moving into the okay parts of the game, this is where I put the core gameplay loop itself and the mission loops. There's probably a good 10 or so mission types within the game, and although they're fun to some extent, they definitely get very repetitive by the end game. And I think this is why I like the Riddler side missions so much. I would say the game's pacing is pretty okay as well, as the story never really feels like it's overstaying its welcome, but I will say some missions definitely do drag a little bit more than they should, requiring you to do a lot of the same thing over and over again. They do add in some variation by making it so you might only be able to fight with critical hits or grenades, things of that nature. And even though this helps a little bit, it's still functionally the same mission structure that we had before, which is the core issue. Another okay part for me is the game's OST. When it's being cinematic and attempting to draw out emotion from lines like characters such as Lois Lane, it is incredibly strong in my opinion and very well produced. However, when you're in the heat of the action, the music feels like an afterthought. And considering this game is 99% action, it really hurts the immersion of the game's pretty good combat. I'm not saying every game needs to be like Doom and have a driving metal soundtrack for high octane carnage, but the overall energy of this music just felt lacking and almost uninspired, basically coming off as it was composed just to be there and not service what is happening. I would also put the game's voice acting in the just okay section. Although most of the characters are actually well acted, technically, the direction of the voice acting and just the way that their voices interact in cutscenes is a little off-putting at certain points. Some lines feel like there's way too much space between them, while others feel too on top of one another. It's not an all the time issue, but it does happen enough that I could begin to notice how bad it would get. Also, as an Australian, massive complaint, Captain Boomerang is absolutely awful. Even though Daniel Lapine, the voice actor for Boomerang, is Australian, and I don't blame him, but it feels like he was told to ham that shit up to 11 and do the most over-the-top Aussie accent possible. Now, for Americans, I could see this being a non-issue, and I understand. I don't know if you watch my Taking Out the Trash on Dead Island, but that is one of the worst accents I've ever damn heard, and this is pretty close. Not as bad, but pretty damn close. The best way I can put it is imagine every single American character ever being forced to talk in a southern accent regardless of any other factors, but they've got to do it in the most cartoony way possible. That is sort of how it felt listening to Boomerang. The last main okay point for me is the level design itself, taking place in a run-down, war-torn metropolis. Suicide Squad has a lot of buildings for you to scale and traverse, but it doesn't really feel like they're doing anything other than just being there. They're there to help you avoid being on street level, at least early on until you've leveled up, but that's about it. Speaking of, the leveling system does feel like it's sort of just there, somewhat of an afterthought. Even though it does impact your character and their abilities, it does feel pretty safe for what it is. It doesn't really try to do anything fun, which I do feel is a little disappointing. You have these characters that are meant to be outlandish, so why not get a little silly with it? Finally, we're moving into the bad. Sadly, I have to put a major component of the game here, and that is its dialogue and character writing. It's no surprise if you've heard anything from this game, but it is pretty bad. Everything feels like it's played off as a joke. There is not a single moment that has had an emotional impact that is left to dwell with the player. It's always trying to be funny, and even if the odd joke does land, 99% of them don't. The game is basically scared to shut the fuck up. At no point do you go more than 30 seconds without someone talking. Whether it's enemies over comms, Lois Lane, Waller, the squad, or someone else, it just feels like the longest bit of silence you get to enjoy exploring is about 5 seconds. It's almost as if the game is scared to let you be left with your own thoughts while playing, which ironically is what can ruin the experience for pretty much anyone trying to play the game. And even though yes, the Suicide Squad is meant to be somewhat of a fourth wall breaking series and be self-referential, the entire experience is just bogged down by this. No one is free from this bad writing either. Every member of the Justice League, Amanda Waller, Lex, and even Brainiac all have moments that are meant to be super serious that just get thrown out because it's meant to be a joke to the squad. Thankfully, the plot itself is interesting enough for me personally to justify finishing the story, but my god, it was a struggle. The next bad part of the game for me is the fact that no matter how many enemies I would kill, it never felt like I was taking Metropolis back. It's actually a big issue that plagues the game. I do understand that obviously you need to keep things there in order to have something to do, but at a certain point, it just becomes a bit of a joke. I had multiple instances where enemies would basically respawn about 5 minutes after I just cleared out the area, if not spawn in on the building just next to me. It really made the combat feel pointless, and that sucks because, as I said, I thoroughly enjoyed the combat system when it was in full flight. Moving into my final issue with Suicide Squad, and it's very simply the most obvious thing, and that's the fact it's a live service game. It didn't need to have a battle pass, it didn't need a premium currency, it could have had just regular DLC packs and just regular online co-op. It would have been a perfectly functional game. However, thanks to executives trying to squeeze every possible cent out of you, the player, you essentially got scammed if you bought this game at launch, because now all those things that you paid for are basically useless. The game is going to be a shell of its former self. And it's not like it was a 10 out of 10 experience even with the online stuff, but the fact is the game is going to be a lesser experience overall. It's going to turn into essentially a single player campaign game that isn't particularly great. It should have been this at the start and then added on, as I mentioned, with DLC packs. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of DLC as a practice, I much prefer it to live service, because live service games only have a limited shelf life. We're seeing more and more of these games get shut down and thrown out. We're seeing games that have had hundreds of millions of dollars poured into them, years of work just thrown out because they're not instantly profitable. And I do appreciate again that this game is going offline. I do appreciate that they did finish adding in all the extra content that they planned at launch. However, now the game is going offline, that's all pointless. If you paid for this game at launch, you've been scammed. And even though Warner Brothers technically have the defense of you've only paid for a license for the game, they can still go suck a dick, as can any shitty publisher like EA, Ubisoft, and Activision. At the end of the day, I don't blame Rocksteady for what happened with Suicide Squad. I blame Warner Brothers, because I think they've made the game hit a marketing checklist more so than letting them develop a good game. Publishers seem to have forgotten that gamers will buy games that are good, not because they have certain features. Sure, those features might be a selling point to an extent, but those features have to elevate the game first. And in Suicide Squad's case, these systems absolutely ruined the experience. I know I'm a tiny speck in the great ocean of YouTube, and no executive is ever going to hear this. However, if it somehow magically does get out to one of them, please let the developers make the game they know gamers want. Don't hit some checklist because you think that it's going to make you money. Let them make a good game. A good game will always sell. A shit game will just always be a shit game. Suicide Squad is arguably the most mediocre game I think I've ever played in my damn life. I have to give it maybe a 4.5 to 5 out of 10. It's a game that's there. If you paid for it, play it. And if you haven't got it, don't get it. Even though it goes on sale for stupid cheap, unless you're a massive DC fan. If you are a big DC fan, I think there is enough here for you, at least when it's on sale. But if you're not, this really isn't for you or anybody. I think they really dropped the ball here. Fuck you, Warner Bros. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. Thank you so much for watching the first video of 2025, and again, thank you so much for all the support back in 2024. I do have some relatively lofty goals as far as I see it for my channel this year, but again, I want to thank everyone for their support, because we managed to get into the partner program last year, as well as break 1,000 subs, and potentially by the time this video comes out, we should have ads. Hey, making money off this. Woo. Not that that's the reason I actually do this, because it's a fun hobby that keeps me sane. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting that like button. If you want to go that extra step, you can hit the subscribe button. If you want to go that extra mile, you can support me on Ko-fi, Patreon, or YouTube memberships like these lovely people here. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there. Bye.